I think faith is messy, and we do need more stories that sort of explore faith and all of its sort of messy complexity. I think we should not be afraid to go to very dark places as storytellers, as long as the light ultimately is more powerful than the darkness.
One particular filmmaker recently caught my attention due to a lot of buzz surrounding his latest feature film, Surprised by Oxford. The film tells the true story of Carolyn Weber's time at Oxford and how she discovered her faith. I had the pleasure of speaking with the writer and director about how he told this story and why it's not a conventional faith-based film. So here is my conversation with Ryan Whitaker. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing very well. How about you?
Doing all right. Yeah, it's always great to speak with fellow filmmakers and my favorite subject, which is faith and film coming together. So the first time I discovered any promotional material for your film was on X or what was Twitter. And it was somebody who was raving about the film. I don't remember who the person was, but it kind of came across my feed and how it involved Christian apologetics. And that's immediately one of my favorite subjects. So I was like, all right, I'm into this. I want to know more about this. And it was like, oh, it's in theaters. And, I have two young kids, so I can't go to the theater that much anymore. So I was like, I'll check it out eventually. And then soon after that, I saw that Jeremy Boring from the Daily Wire was raving about the film as well. I was like, there's that film again. And then all of a sudden, all this stuff about the Pendragon Cycle was coming out. And then there you were again. And I was like, oh my gosh, well, now I really got to check out this movie. So I went, we watched it. Me and my wife sat down and watched it not too long ago. And we really, really enjoyed it. It really was a breath of fresh air. And when you see this sort of like coming of age story told with an appreciation for faith, it's very, very inspiring. So congratulations, first and foremost. It is a great film. Everybody should go check it out. And I believe it's on most streaming platforms now. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. You can rent and purchase the film on Amazon and Apple and all the usual places.
All the usual spots. So if you have any streaming platforms, check it out, look it up. Surprised by Oxford. It's very, very good. Now, I did some research on your previous work because I was very, very curious. I was like, who is this guy?
Oh
And I
boy.
want to know, like, of course, there's all these interviews about how the film came to be, and it's really, really fascinating. Everybody should go check that out. But what surprised me about checking out your previous films, and forgive me if I snooped a little too much, but I was like, I need to see your other work. I need to know what other films this person has made. And I came across a lot of your short films. And I was actually surprised by how dark they were. So my first question from a filmmaker's perspective is, how did you feel approaching this film knowing the tone wouldn't be very similar to your previous films? That's kind of a jump to make for any filmmaker to go from this gritty portfolio of work to suddenly
Mhm.
this story about a young woman who's finding her faith at Oxford.
Well, there are two. I would say there's two parts to the answer.
Hmm.
One is that I have always loved genre
Hmm.
films. You're sitting in front of posters for The Matrix and Inception, so I
Yes.
think you have an appreciation for that as well.
Hmm.
I grew up sort of in the Bible Belt here. I grew up in Nashville,
Hmm.
around the Christian music industry, knew everybody in that world, and kind of by extension got to know everybody in this sort of blossoming sort of faith-based cinema world that was happening,
Hmm.
largely happening here. Um, and for whatever reason, I just sort of ran in the opposite direction. I just didn't really want to. It felt to me like a lot of people were um, making films that were sort of sermons in the form of a movie, and I wasn't
Hmm.
really interested in that because it felt like preaching to the choir. And
Hmm.
so I just sort of doubled down on my interest in genre. And so yeah, my first film was this little indie fantasy movie called After that I made for $700,000 and shot in Birmingham, Alabama, and
Hmm.
um, had no business making for the money that we had for that film. Ended up having, a couple hundred VFX shots and CGI monster and all this stuff.
Hmm.
And so that was sort of my plan, was to continue to sort of go down that path. I'm a big film noir fan as well, so I just
Hmm.
kind of these darker stories, as you say, interested me. And it wasn't until I read Surprised by Oxford, the book by Carolyn Weber, which was given to me by my mom and my sister, that I began to consider if I could sort of take take a swing at this very unhelpful term that we always hear, faith-based film,
Mhm.
which I've always thought is kind of reductive. But what was, I mean, they said, it's all your favorite stuff in one book, which is kind of true because I am an Anglophile. I love the UK, I love Oxford, I love the Inklings. And
Mhm.
so, Carolyn's story sort of intersects with all those things. And so
Mhm.
I thought it was interesting because it was a story of conversion ultimately, but it was sort of approaching it in a more intellectual and
Mhm.
philosophical way. And so I thought, well, if there's a way to sort of capture that aspect of the book in a film, I think that would be an interesting and hopefully sort of refreshing take on that kind of narrative.
Yeah, and it definitely had this kind of this balance because I've heard you speak in other interviews about how you're not particularly fond of the label of faith-based films or faith-adjacent films, which I tend to agree with you that I don't like that label. And it's not, I don't want people to misread this, is that I'm not saying that I dislike that those films exist or that I dislike that they're making those films. I'm very happy that they're around. But what I dislike about that label is that it makes the audience immediately expect something in particular. And that's something that's kind of hard for us to overcome because you're trying to pave a new type of film here. And I kind of like that and appreciate that. I actually just spoke with Brock Heasley, who directed The Shift.
Yeah.
And since I asked him kind of the same question, which is since faith is such an integral part of this story and this film and Surprised by Oxford, how do you handle balancing the faith-based elements without it coming across as preaching to the audience? Like, because it's not so much that there's themes there. This isn't a Lord of the Rings-esque where you can kind of interpret the mythos how you want to be Christian or faith-based. That this is actually faith is part of the story. And it's kind of
Mhm.
how do you approach that without it being preaching to the choir, if you will?
Well, that was the part of it that really scared me, to be honest,
Mhm.
when I was adapting the book. Um, I I think I knew pretty early on, sort of structurally, how the movie wanted to be told. But then, getting into the details of um, specifically these conversations between Caro and Kent in the film. In the book, they have these in-depth conversations about like the reliability of biblical manuscripts. I mean, they get very in the weeds on a lot of things.
Mhm.
And I think I played around with some of that in earlier drafts, but I realized that, I just feared that we were going to lose the audience and um, it was going to go down the path that I didn't want to go down. And what ended up being sort of the light bulb moment for me was realizing that um, the right way in was through this Sehnsucht idea that Lewis talks about in his writing of kind of this sacred longing for something beyond yourself, which
Mhm.
is in the context of Caro's story is an emotional thing, but because she sort of shut herself off to it largely shut herself off emotionally
Mhm.
and yet feels this sort of pull through the literature she's reading and the art that
Mhm.
she's into
Mhm.
um, and so I realized, okay, that needs to be sort of that the path in to those
Mhm.
conversations about faith. Um, but then in some cases, it was just about sort of owning what it was
Mhm.
and just being confident that it is what it is. I mean, it's probably an understatement to say that movies about chastity aren't very popular. And so, that was an important aspect of the story. And it was just one of those things where it's like, okay, there's no way around this. Like, it just is what
Mhm.
it is. And I think
Mhm.
part of it was leaning into some of the comedic beats around that
Mhm.
subject where it was, he obviously takes it seriously, but at the same time, he doesn't take himself too seriously, which I think helps.
Mhm.
So interestingly, it's like it's some that chastity element was something I was kind of worried about, and um, I haven't heard anybody bring that up as something that was a sort of a deterrent in the viewing of the film. So I think I guess that's a win.
Yeah, I think so. And it's the same thing I kind of talked with Brock is that I think that most people kind of appreciate films that do have a little bit more modesty to their content and that can also take things and make it more
Mhm.
mature. and not have it be so preachy. So I noticed that you talked in your blog, and you alluded to this in some of the behind the scenes of the film. It's the idea of romanticizing. In the first half of the film, Oxford and the shots that you got are gorgeous. They're really, really great. And it's really impressive that you were able to shoot at Oxford. And I want to talk with you more about that later. But the first half, it shows it is very majestical and beautiful. But the second half of the film, taking the journey with the character, the cinematography and the tone kind of changes to this dark, cold kind of place. And I do think there's a parallel there with how we romanticize faith, especially in movies. I think most of the time, discovering faith, that no matter what part in your life you end up coming to it or not coming to it, it's usually an ugly experience. From what I've seen and told from other people, it's not this cookie cutter, like I just, it's not the version that you would see in a traditional faith-based movie. That's, I'm glad they exist. I'll say it over and over again, but it doesn't represent real life to me. It doesn't seem like that's usually how people find faith, where I see kind of in your film, like that's more so how it is found. It's this messy and very complex process that takes a while. So as a filmmaker, do you think we should explore conveying faith in films being more complex and nuanced rather than always having a happy ending?
No, I mean, absolutely. And that's very much something that I'm drawn to. And I think, I mean, as you mentioned, I think Surprise by Oxford touches on that, even though it does have ultimately a happy ending. But it's not a happy ending with every sort of, bow tied, and it's not a perfect ending.
Yeah.
And I think faith is messy, and we do need more stories that sort of explore faith and all of its sort of messy complexity. So yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. But I think ultimately it's about the story you're telling, right? It's like what is the story?
Yeah.
And what are sort of the demands of that particular story?
That's why I brought you on. I just wanted you to affirm all of my previous beliefs, and this is working out so well. Like, perfect. I got affirmation. No, actually, I was going to ask, like, do you think that any genre film can incorporate maybe not so much overt faith-based themes, but can effectively do it appropriately in any type of genre? I'm asking for somebody who makes horror movies. I don't know who that would be,
Yes.
but
Yes, I do. I don't think any genre is off limits.
oh, okay. See,
I
like
think it's just about what is the story you're telling, and
mhm.
what's the perspective. So, I mean, I'll give you a great example. I think a movie that I think is it's one of my favorite movies of all time, incredibly dark movie, which is generally classified as a horror film, is the movie The Night of the Hunter, directed by Charles Laughton, starring Robert Mitchum.
Haven't seen that one, but
It's,
I it's on my list.
it's a very dark sort of Southern Gothic horror movie, um, about a wolf in sheep's clothing, a pastor who kind of moves from town to town, marrying women and then murdering them. And I mean, it's a very, very dark story. But it's a story that ultimately has this sort of redemptive arc. And you have to just experience the story kind of in context to understand what I'm saying. But it is ultimately about light overcoming darkness. I think we should not be afraid to go to very dark places as storytellers, as long as the light ultimately is more powerful than the darkness. Is sort of my basic idea about that.
There's also the commercial aspect to it as well, which is, I mean, you don't want to go so dark that suddenly no one wants to watch this. And maybe that could be counter-argued with the idea of artistic integrity. But I think at the end of the day, it's, what's your hierarchy of value and how do you want to convey that? And I think specifically for the stuff that I make, I mean, I make horror films, and people think like horror films and faith-based films, like they don't go together. And I would say the irony is that most horror films contain more religious tone and imagery and themes than any other genre I can think of. But we get distracted and hung up on sometimes the kind of grotesqueness of whether that genre would be, and it does go too far many, many times. But like you said, and I was fully anticipating you saying it just comes down to the story. What is the story you're trying to tell?
That's
It's
right.
not
What's
so
the
much
context?
right. Yeah, it's like what is the point of this? Are you trying to just scare people just for the heck of it? You don't need to tell a movie or make a movie to do that. I mean, you could just go down your
Yeah,
willful universe.
or is it about glorifying darkness? And I think
Right.
that's where I have a problem. But Yeah, you're right. I mean, the horror genre, I think in some ways, especially when you think about sort of spiritual horror,
Hmm.
so often incorporates faith more than a lot of films
Hmm.
that you see in terms of mainstream films. I mean, I think of something like The Conjuring, which was written by my friends Chad and Carrie Hayes, and
Hmm.
that film has some interesting faith elements, and you can
Hmm.
sort of get away with it in a way in a way in the horror genre in ways that you can't elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of, I mean, I could get so go off track on this subject, but maybe in a second interview, you and I could just do strictly horror talking since you have a background kind of, I don't know, like would you classify your movie After as a horror film? That kind of looked like that was a supernatural thriller to me.
It's not really a horror film, but I guess it has some elements of horror.
Yeah, that's kind of usually how I would classify my films. Like, I don't like to call them horror. It's just I know the label helps the marketing of the aspect of, how to pitch it to people. But most of the
Sure.
time, it's like there's horror elements, but this is mostly a drama type of thing for the stuff. But anyway, so in terms of Surprised by Oxford, this is a question that is more so related to the Inklings because C.S. Lewis obviously comes up a lot in the film. And
Mhm.
obviously, you're familiar with the Inklings and Tolkien and that whole group. So they had a famous disagreement about how to convey their stories. I don't know if it would necessarily be a disagreement or debate, but they approached it differently, which was Lewis used to write his stories. Particularly, you can look at Narnia as a clear example of overt allegory to Christianity. Aslan is Christ dies, resurrects. No, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read the books or seen the movies. So it's very overt, the Christian themes that are in his stories. Whereas Tolkien didn't take that approach.
Mhm.
He was like, no, when I want to do Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion or anything else he wanted to do, he said he didn't want to incorporate his religious beliefs into the narrative. He wanted it to be inspired by that and have the readers interpret the mythos on their own. So this isn't like a right or wrong per se. It's just a matter of preference. But I wanted to know what you preferred when it comes to how you convey faith in your films and your stories. Do you prefer kind of the allegory C.S. Lewis take or the Tolkien take where it should be, no, I don't even want to mention or have it be obvious at all. I want people to interpret it their own way.
Well, it's interesting because I think that conversation is more nuanced
Hmm.
um, than um, than we think. I mean, even Lewis, even Lewis said the Narnia books were not allegory, because he said he didn't like allegory.
Hmm.
It's easy, I think, on a surface glance to sort of read into those stories these
Hmm.
allegorical elements. And some are easier, some are kind of, more blatant than others, like Aslan, right?
Hmm.
Um, but then there's a lot of sort of complexity to characters in those stories, and it's not always there's not always like an easy one for one sort of
Hmm.
comparison. So uh, all that to say, certainly, in comparing Narnia and Lord of the Rings, um, Tolkien's writing is, I guess you could argue, less allegorical than Narnia, regardless of what Lewis would say.
Yeah.
I would say, generally speaking, I'm drawn more towards um, less of an allegorical approach and more and I mean actually Lewis again like described his own stories as using metaphor rather than allegory. And I
Hmm.
think and again it's sort of a matter of debate, but I think that's probably what I'm drawn to more because I think it can be a little sort of reductive when some allegory can be. uh,
Yeah.
I think it's easy to sort of get pigeonholed sort of, you know um, so but again, I think it's sort of the demands of the particular story that you're telling.
Yeah, and the reason I ask is because like when we see films that particularly allegorical or not, if they have anything that kind of brings up faith, there is that immediate like, how is the audience going to perceive this? Are they going to perceive this as like, oh, here they go, they're going to start propagandizing the whole thing, or it's just going to be this message movie versus an actual story?
Right.
And it is tempting, and I'm totally guilty of putting in it's not even an allegory, it's like direct symbolism, like putting a Christian cross in one of my movies and someone professing to it. It's like I understand the impulse to want to do that as a filmmaker because it's the thing I care about most in my life. Like I'd give up all my movies in a heartbeat, and keep my faith. And I obviously prioritize that over anything else. So I get the impulse there, but I think the audience, they don't want that. They want the story to be good and for there to be that symbolism there, maybe, but it's really hard to find that balance. And obviously, like I can't take a side on either one of, Lewis or Tolkien. They're both great writers and, legends in their own right. So it's just a fascinating kind of difference in perspective of how they approach their stories, but they're both great, obviously. But I was going to mention too, as I brought up Brock Heasley, and he did The Shift. And as I'm sure you know, that film was produced by Ken Carpenter, who is one of the producers
I'm aware
on
of
your.
that.
Yeah. If you didn't know,
Yes.
the producer of your film also produced that movie. So he, like you mentioned in the behind the scenes, which everyone should go check out the behind the scenes. I mean, if you're a film geek like me, you always like to watch the behind the scenes as much as you like to watch the movie. But you mentioned how everything changed once he came on board the project. So what was it like working with him? Did he provide a lot of guidance for you, given his history in the field?
Ken and I have known each other for a long time,
Mhm.
20 years at least. And
Mhm.
we, did I just do that?
I think so. There was a big thumbs up there. I thought that was
I don't
Ken
know
for a
what I
second
did.
watching it.
I don't know what I did. Um, Thumbs up to that. Yeah, we've known each other for a long time. I mean, part of the same community here, and we had a lot of mutual friends. But I never really worked with Ken until, well, thumbs up.
I've never seen that before. It's kind of funny, actually.
Hold
I
on
just
a
keep
second.
assuming, it's part of what you're it's part of the commentary.
Um, can you tell I don't know what I'm doing? So we never worked together. We met about this project the day before he flew to Ireland to shoot a movie called Finding You,
Hmm.
and which was really bad timing on my part because he was about to go shoot this other movie. But then he came home and we reconnected. And I think I think movies are so hard to make.
Hmm.
You're always just looking for the right people in your corner who actually want to make the same movie that you want to make
Hmm.
and who like just understand it on a fundamental level what it is.
Hmm.
And this one specifically, especially because it was trying again, kind of trying to do something different. I think
Hmm.
so it was really important just that the team that came around the film, um, it's always important that everybody's trying to make the same movie. But I think especially on this one, it was really important to me that everybody really understood the DNA of the story that we were telling. And Ken just sort of, understood that very early on. Um, and so I find that as a director, when you team up with a good producer, it's just sort of wind in the sails for the project, and then hopefully you just find a way to sort of get the train out of the station and
Hmm.
start to sort of build it, piece by piece. So yeah, it was definitely a turning point when Ken came on board.
Yeah, and I haven't met him yet, but it seems like I'm running in the same circles that same people he keeps working with. So
Terrible
hopefully,
guy, just the worst, horrible
sounds
human.
sounds like just worst kind of person.
And we
But
Ken and I started a company together after Surprise by Oxford, so we're working on several things now. So
oh, say like secretive new projects coming up. Well, that's exciting. It's awesome that you guys are still going to be working on new projects because I've worked with producers in the past, and a lot of times you're like, oh, we stay in contact because a lot of this in the business is just building your network
yeah,
and reliable connections. But a lot of times they get busy working on other stuff. But it's great to hear that you guys are going into business together. That's awesome. And you kind of mentioned, and I read your blog about the making of the film. Again, I really snooped. I snooped a lot.
you really
You're,
did. It
yeah.
was uncomfortable.
I was like, I need to do some research on who is this? Who is this guy?
So
But
you were the one
I
that read it. That's now I know. Yeah.
I was gonna make that joke, but I'm glad you did. But nonetheless, I think that when I was reading that, you talked about how the film had this uncategorizableness. I
Mm.
love that non-word, but I was like trying to like,
Yeah.
am I gonna say that
Yeah.
right on the first
Uh-huh.
attempt?
Yeah.
And I imagine, like you you've talked about how difficult the film was to make, and films are really hard. Anybody who's ever done this before knows it's incredibly difficult. I mean, they call it development hell for a reason. So how did you overcome that? Because when you look at the film on paper, you look at the memoir, you look at the story, it just screams faith-based. It just screams that. Like, it just seems like what it is. But then you had this whole vision of like, no, it's not that. How did you pitch that to people? How was that, conveyed in a sense where you're like, it's
Poorly.
not what yeah.
Um,
Well,
yeah, I
trial and
mean,
error, apparently.
it is funny because you're right. It's like, it did check a lot of boxes, for what it seemed like people were looking for,
Hmm.
at least within that sort of faith-based construct. But then it was doing things that other movies weren't doing.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm always kind of hesitant to say like, oh, it's edgy. It's like, what does that even mean? So it's so
Yeah.
relative. But I think in the context of what else was being made, it felt a little edgy. And um, so it didn't feel safe, I guess. And
Hmm.
so, really no one in that world wanted to make the movie
Hmm.
because of that. And
I
so
could
I think I
imagine.
realized pretty quickly that the only way to make this film the way I wanted to make it was to do it independently.
Mhm.
So that became the path, was just to sort of how do we, pull the financing together and go make this
Mhm.
movie. So that became the goal.
My best guess when I was looking at this, going like, how did you pitch this? And just in given my experience going through this process, is I was like, you probably had to pitch yourself and just say like, trust me. At a certain point, you're like, the story's there. It's based on a best-selling memoir. We already got some elements there.
Not,
You
yeah,
know
that's
what?
not very convincing
Yeah,
for people.
probably not. But it is something where you're like, a lot of it was there, but I feel like the bulk of it had to be just, listen, you just have to trust me on this one. Like, just it'll work, but I'm sure
Well,
there
I
was a
do
lot of
remember. Yeah,
rejection.
it's interesting that you say that. I don't know that I said those words, but
Mm,
I definitely had the feeling that if it didn't make sense on paper to a lot of
mm,
people, it was just because they needed to go make the movie. And once I made the movie and they saw the final product, they would understand what it is that I was trying to
right.
do. And
Mm,
it did feel a little bit um, like there was a bit of sort of confusion, I think, about what is this and what is it trying to do.
mm.
And so again, like the answer but just became we just have to go make this film independently, and that's the way to sort of preserve the vision for it and to make it the way that we want to make it,
Hmm.
with as few cooks in the kitchen as possible.
Yeah. So I only have like one more question for you, but I'm assuming you can't talk about the Pendragon cycle coming up too much. But there's a lot of really great behind the scenes videos of you being featured in those videos that are coming out. And I recommend anybody who's a filmmaker to check out those videos. It's incredibly fun just to watch the anticipation of the show. It's really great marketing on their end. So it's a kind of peek into the scale of the project like this. If you like filmmaking, definitely check them out. So it looks like you're moving on up in your career, which congratulations. That's awesome. Good to see it.
Thank you.
So like, but
It's been a crazy
yeah,
crazy year working on that project.
I can imagine. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a lot more stuff coming about that when it's time to get ready to release the series. But what's next for you now that that series is finished in principal photography and in post? I mean, you mentioned you're starting a business
Mhm.
with Ken. Is there any projects in particular you can share with that you're working on at
Yeah,
the moment?
yeah. So I mean, and I mean, there's stuff up on my IMDb Pro and stuff, so people can see this stuff. But there's several TV projects that I'm working on, but on the feature side, the one that's probably kind of just closest to being ready to go is a G.K. Chesterton adaptation called The Ball and the Cross, which is based on his novel, and it's a ridiculous like adventure comedy set in England in 1910.
Mm,
Sort of the tone of it is like Monty Python meets The Princess Bride, so it would be ridiculous fun to make.
mm.
So I'm hoping that we will be on the ground before too long, making
Nice.
that. We'll see.
Awesome. So venturing into comedy now. I mean, an adaptation nonetheless. I mean, that's another ambitious. I mean, we're talking about the whole spectrum of genres here. Well, no, that's awesome though, because
I have
again,
very
these
broad tastes.
I do too. What's funny is that like I have all these sci-fi. I mean, literally, I have a Terminator 2 poster right here. So like sci-fi is my favorite genre. Never made a sci-fi film. I'm stuck in horror, but I'd like to venture off into new genres eventually. But yeah, and comedy is actually my root. That's kind of like where I spent most of my time filmmaking as a kid. But that's great to hear. I mean, it's really awesome. So again, I want to thank you for so much for your time, Ryan. This has been such a pleasure to talk with you about your film. But one final thing, and we can totally edit this out if this is like not kosher to bring up, but I apologize in advance because I'd be in big trouble if I didn't mention this, at least here in person while I'm talking to you. My wife and my wife's family are huge fans of your dad's music.
Oh,
I could
awesome.
I could potentially be in like big trouble if I didn't at least mention it to you, speaking to you once about it. But they're big
Nice.
fans, and I sincerely did not know of the connection before I booked this interview with you. So forgive me, but yeah, they're my family had, or my wife's family, they said like big influence on them, big part of my wife's childhood. So
Oh, it's
thank
cool.
you for all of that. I mean, you and your family, we really appreciate it. So they're big
Oh
fans.
man, that's awesome. It's awesome to
Yeah.
hear.
But okay, so aside from that, I want to thank you again for your time. I really enjoyed talking with you. And again, everybody should check out Surprised by Oxford. It's on pretty much any streaming platform out there. So definitely check it out. Google search it, find out which platform it's on, rent it, watch it. And also be on the lookout for the Pendragon Cycle coming out. Ryan's been big involvement in that, so it's gonna be a big thing coming out. Really excited about all of that. So yeah, looking forward to seeing what's next for you, sir.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this.